The dawn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire stood as one of the largest and most powerful realms on Earth, stretching across continents, climates, and cultures. Yet beneath its vast territorial expanse lay a fragile and deeply strained foundation. The Romanov Dynasty, which had ruled Russia since 1613, projected an image of divine authority and unshakable permanence. But by the time Tsar Nicholas II ascended the throne in 1894, that image had already begun to fracture under the weight of modernization, political unrest, and widening inequality. The imperial court in St. Petersburg shimmered with opulence, its gilded halls and intricate architecture serving not merely as symbols of wealth, but as deliberate affirmations of an unbroken autocratic tradition. Yet, in the streets beyond these palace walls, industrial workers toiled in harsh conditions, peasants struggled with land shortages, and revolutionary ideas quietly gained momentum. Nicholas II himself was not the kind of ruler history tends to remember as forceful or visionary. Rather, he was a deeply conservative man, raised to believe in the absolute authority of the monarchy and the divine right of kings, yet personally hesitant and often overwhelmed by the responsibilities that came with ruling such a vast empire. His marriage to Empress Alexandra brought a sense of personal devotion into his life, but it also introduced complexities that would later shape the fate of the dynasty. Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, carried with her both a strong will and a profound sense of religious destiny, traits that would influence her decisions in ways that the Russian court found increasingly troubling. The architectural landscape of Imperial Russia during this period reflected a tension between tradition and change. The Winter Palace, with its Baroque grandeur and imposing scale, stood as a physical manifestation of centuries-old autocracy, its endless corridors and ceremonial rooms reinforcing the distance between ruler and subject. In contrast, the rise of industrial cities introduced stark, utilitarian structures that spoke of a different Russia, one driven by labor, machinery, and the restless energy of a population beginning to question its place within the empire. This contrast was not merely aesthetic, it represented a deeper divide that would eventually erupt into conflict. The early years of Nicholas II's reign were marked by a series of events that exposed the vulnerabilities of the Romanov rule. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, initially perceived by the government as a manageable conflict, quickly turned into a humiliating defeat. Russia's loss to a rising Asian power shattered the myth of imperial invincibility and triggered widespread dissatisfaction among the population. This dissatisfaction culminated in the events of January 1905, when peaceful demonstrators gathered in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar, only to be met with gunfire from imperial troops. The incident, later known as Bloody Sunday, became a defining moment, eroding the bond between the monarchy and the people it governed. In the aftermath of these events, Nicholas II was compelled to introduce limited reforms, including the establishment of a legislative body known as the Duma. However, these reforms were carefully constrained, designed to preserve the autocratic core of the monarchy, while offering only the illusion of shared governance. This approach satisfied neither the reformers, who demanded meaningful change, nor the conservatives who feared any concession as a threat to imperial authority. The result was a political environment marked by instability, where distrust grew on all sides. Within the private sphere of the imperial family, another crisis was unfolding, one that would remain hidden from the public for years, but would ultimately have profound consequences. The birth of the Tsarevich Alexei brought both joy and despair to the Romanovs. As the long-awaited male heir, his existence secured the line of succession, yet he suffered from hemophilia, a genetic condition that rendered even minor injuries potentially fatal. The secrecy surrounding his illness created an atmosphere of anxiety and isolation within the royal household, particularly for Alexandra, whose desperation to protect her son led her to seek help beyond the boundaries of conventional medicine. It was within this context that Grigory Rasputin entered the lives of the Romanovs. A mystic from Siberia, Rasputin possessed an enigmatic presence that both fascinated and alarmed those who encountered him. To Alexandra, he appeared as a figure of divine intervention, someone capable of easing her son's suffering and preserving the future of the dynasty. To many members of the Russian aristocracy and political elite, however, Rasputin represented a dangerous intrusion into the highest levels of power, his influence seen as both inappropriate and destabilizing. Rumors and scandals surrounding his behavior circulated widely, further damaging the already fragile reputation of the monarchy. As the years progressed, the gap between the imperial family and the Russian people continued to widen. Economic hardship, political repression, and the growing influence of revolutionary movements created a volatile environment in which the authority of the Tsar was increasingly questioned. Yet Nicholas II remained steadfast in his belief that maintaining autocracy was essential to preserving the empire. This conviction, combined with his reluctance to adapt to changing circumstances, would prove to be one of the most consequential factors in the unfolding tragedy. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 marked a turning point, not only for Russia but for the Romanov Dynasty itself. Initially greeted with a surge of patriotic enthusiasm, the war soon exposed the weaknesses of the Russian state. Military defeats, logistical failures, and the immense human cost of the conflict placed enormous strain on the nation. In a decision that would have far-reaching implications, Nicholas II chose to take personal command of the Russian army, leaving the governance of the empire in the hands of Alexandra. This move, intended to demonstrate leadership and commitment, instead distanced the Tsar from the political realities of the capital, while placing Alexandra in a position for which she was neither prepared nor widely accepted. In St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Petrograd to emphasize its Russian identity during the war, Alexandra's reliance on Rasputin deepened. His perceived influence over state affairs fueled public outrage and intensified the perception that the monarchy had lost its connection to reality. Meanwhile, shortages of food and fuel led to widespread suffering among the population, and strikes and protests became increasingly common. The grand architecture of the imperial capital, once a symbol of stability and power, now stood in stark contrast to the unrest unfolding in its streets. By the winter of 1917, the situation had reached a breaking point. The empire that had once seemed unassailable was now teetering on the edge of collapse, its institutions weakened, its people disillusioned, and its rulers isolated. What followed would not only bring an end to centuries of Romanov rule, but would also reshape the course of Russian history in ways that few could have anticipated. Yet, even as the forces of revolution gathered strength, the imperial family remained largely unaware of the full extent of the danger they faced, their fate slowly converging toward a night that would become one of the most haunting chapters in modern history. By early 1917, Petrograd no longer felt like the heart of an empire, but a city slowly losing control over itself. Snow-covered streets and grand buildings still stood tall, yet behind this calm surface, tension had reached a breaking point. Food shortages had become severe, and long bread lines stretched across entire districts. Workers, exhausted from endless factory shifts, now faced hunger at home. This daily struggle quietly turned frustration into anger. The protests began almost naturally. Women textile workers, already pushed to their limits, stepped into the streets demanding bread. Their voices were not political at first, but desperate. Yet as crowds grew, something changed. Workers from other factories joined, then students, then ordinary citizens. What started as hunger protests slowly transformed into a mass movement. The government responded with force, but the system was already weakening. Soldiers were ordered to fire on civilians, yet many refused. Some hesitated, others lowered their weapons entirely. In those moments, the balance of power shifted. The empire had always depended on military loyalty, and now that loyalty was breaking. Nicholas II, far away at military headquarters, failed to grasp how serious the situation had become. Reports reaching him were delayed and incomplete. He believed order could still be restored, but reality had already moved beyond his control. In Petrograd, power began to split. The Duma tried to form a temporary government, while workers and soldiers created the Soviet. Two authorities now existed side by side, neither fully in control. This was no longer a protest. It was the collapse of an entire system. At the Alexander Palace, the imperial family remained isolated. What was once a peaceful residence now felt like confinement. Guards monitored movement, and information came in fragments. Alexandra struggled to understand how everything was falling apart, while Nicholas appeared increasingly resigned. When abdication finally came, it was quiet, almost inevitable. Nicholas signed away the throne, ending over 3 centuries of Romanov rule. In that moment, the empire did not fall with noise or spectacle, but with a silence that carried far greater weight.